the Honorable Vice President of India, Shri Jagdeep Dhankar, this galaxy of distinguished public personalities, not just within the judiciary, former Chief Justices, judges, but sitting judges and beyond. I was looking at the signboards with so much of trepidation. Public life, MPs, ministers, judges, reserve, judges. I launch upon this endeavor with a degree of fear in my heart, the same sort that I had when I first presented my argument for consideration before a single judge of the High Court. Professor Rajkumar, Dr. Abhishek Singhvi, Mr. Avishkar Singhvi, other family members of Dr. L.M. Singhvi, and the distinguished invitees who are part of this evening's event. Good evening. I'm happy to have this opportunity to honor the memory of one of the tallest doyens of the Indian Bar, Dr. L.M. Singhvi. I have many fond memories of my childhood in the home of Dr. Singhvi and his very gracious spouse, and I have looked up to him as I began my career in the law. One of my early cases as a lawyer was when we were briefed to appear on behalf of Renu Sagar in an arbitration matter which came up before Chief Justice Chittadosh Mukherjee and Justice Sujata Manohar in the Bombay High Court. We had a difficult case, almost a bad one. But Dr. Singhvi really, with his profound learning and wisdom, embellished it, not just with the law, but with literature and with life, and brought us, at least in our own view, on the threshold of victory which was eventually denied to us. An astute jurist, a fierce parliamentarian, and a prolific writer, Dr. L.M. Singhvi was an encyclopedia of knowledge on Indian history and culture. Dr. L.M. Singhvi played an important role in shaping Indian public life through his career as a lawyer, as well as a distinguished parliamentarian. One of the most significant causes that Dr. L.M. Singhvi championed was the Panchayati Raj institution, with a focus on the importance of self-government. To honor Dr. L.M. Singhvi's commitment to the role played by citizens and their engagement with electoral democracy, I am speaking today on the topic Universal Adult Franchise, translating India's political transformation into a social transformation. First, I will talk about the historical context in which we must reflect on the idea of universal adult franchise. Second, I will discuss how this idea was deliberated and included in the constitutional discourse leading to the drafting of India's constitution. Third, I will reflect on the impact of universal adult franchise post-independence and how it has created social transformation. Fourth, I shall be talking about how the idea of Panchayati Raj, along with universal adult franchise, led to the deepening of India's democracy. Fifth, I will be reflecting on the connections between universal adult franchise and the idea of participatory democracy. And lastly, I shall be reflecting on the Indian experiment with universal adult franchise. This is an ambitious project which presumes that the audience will not reflect a sense of boredom. First, let me dwell briefly on the historical context to understand universal adult franchise. The context is not just of India, but across the globe. History tells us that power was concentrated in the hands of a few. In many countries, power was used as a medium to control the behavior of people. Even when the idea of democracy emerged, the exercise of power was made limited only to the already powerful, whom we know as the so-called noble class. Democracy then was a means or an instrument to entrenchment. For instance, when the wave of democracy emerged in the world's oldest democracy, the United States of America, the structures of democracy which were set up excluded the marginalized and the oppressed communities. African Americans were not even considered citizens of America when the US Constitution was adopted. In India, we find a historical social system in which power was concentrated in the hands of the upper class of society. The rights which we now consider as universal were not universal all the time. They were denied to the oppressed. This was the norm across the world. Those who did not hold power were subjected to several levels of oppression. Against this power hegemony, several social reformers led movements towards the distribution of power. These movements were to democratize the hold over power by a few communities. When the structure of democracy was adopted by several countries in the 18th and 19th centuries, unfortunately, the exercise of democracy was used to retain power by the few. The right to vote was controlled and exercised by only those individuals who had already succeeded in society because of their social power and cultural capital. For instance, the right to vote was exercised only by those who had certain properties or educational institutions or qualifications, which were the result of not their individual effort, but were a reflection of the influence and hegemony their communities had on society. As a result, the idea of democracy itself was controlled by the elites of society. In that sense, the structure and exercise of democracy were only retrenchments of social privilege and hegemony. Voting rights were denied to women and members of the marginalized communities because the elite did not want to share the power with them and neither considered them to be capable of exercising a wise exercise of citizenship. It is in this history of injustice and exclusion that we must look at the idea of universal adult franchise. The demand for equal voting rights and to become a part of the political process emerged from the marginalized communities across the world. Instances of this challenge can be found in the women's suffrage movement globally and the movement of the socially oppressed. The emergence of social movements to gain voting rights was a simultaneous phenomenon which was taking place across the world. People from different countries found inspiration and learned from each other how to claim an equal say in decision making. If we take the example of the United States, we see that the black community led the struggle to claim their humanity by asking for basic rights such as the right to vote. When the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the American Constitution were adopted because of the struggle of the American black community, we also found a resonance happening in India. It inspired our social leaders coming from the marginalized communities. These social reformers not only demanded equal citizenship for the oppressed, but also started initiatives that could educate the masses about their rights. For instance, prominent social reformers like Jyotiba Phule and Savitribai Phule started schools for girls to make them aware of the happenings in the world and also about their rights. In his book titled Gulamgiri, translated as slavery, Jyotiba Phule appealed to the upper caste Indians that they should make way for the marginalized in the same way the Americans did by abolishing slavery through the 13th Amendment of the US Constitution. In that way, the negotiations against colonial power of the British government were not by a uniform stream of thought. While a few Indians demanded a share in the administration, leaders such as Jyotiba Phule were laying down the groundwork for an alternate picture of providing the chance to become part of the administration to everyone. When the negotiations to give rights to Indians and to draft their constitution were happening in the 20th century, our leaders such as Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar led a strong demand that the conception of a free India cannot happen without giving universal adult franchise. According to Dr. Ambedkar, the idea of universal adult franchise was non-negotiable. In his submissions before the Southborough Committee, the Committee of 1919, which was constituted the draft, the Government of India Act 1919, Dr. Ambedkar categorically asserted that the right to become a part of the political system was interlinked with the idea of citizenship itself. It was his belief that without exercising the right to vote, no one could claim to be a citizen. Babasaheb Ambedkar believed that adult suffrage would create political conscience among the oppressed castes. Therefore, in that sense, the struggle for social change, which happened for several years from the 1920s till independence, aimed at the distribution of power by claiming equal voting rights. The marginalized communities had to struggle every inch to claim equal rights. Therefore, the idea of universal adult franchise is not just a political idea. The idea of universality in adult franchise is a social idea and vision at its core. Our history tells us that society was regulated by denying power to certain communities, and therefore the emergence of universal adult franchise as a demand aimed at undoing centuries of oppression. Furthermore, the idea of a universal adult franchise was also reflected in the political demand for freedom through documents such as the Nehru Committee Report of 1928, the Karachi Resolution of 1931, only to name a few. This evolution was also seen in the debates and discussions of the Constituent Assembly, which is the next segment. Under colonial rule, Indians were still confronted with a limited franchise and limited participation in government. The Government of India Act of 1919 and the Government of India Act of 1935 reflected limited franchise qualified by property, income, and education. Under the 1919 Act, women were categorically disqualified from voting. The 1935 Act, despite providing a broader franchise, could cover only 1/5 of the total population. So when Dr. Ambedkar introduced the principle of universal adult suffrage in the Constituent Assembly on 16 June 1949, there were certainly apprehensions among the members of the Assembly. Certain members opposed it on the ground that adult suffrage presupposes that the electorate is enlightened and believed that in a country with high levels of illiteracy and in a largely poverty-stricken republic, the experiment of universal adult suffrage would not be successful. Some even called it the greatest risk which the Constituent Assembly has taken. At the same time, there were members who considered adult suffrage to be a natural choice to India's freedom movement. After detailed deliberation, the Constituent Assembly decided to adopt adult franchise universally and affirm political equality, marking the transformative character of our Constitution. The nation was shedding its colonial and pre-colonial shackles and evolving to adopt the system of parliamentary democracy based on equality of citizenship and universal adult franchise. The preamble of the Constitution, beginning with the words, "We the people," made it abundantly clear that the will of people of India was a source of sovereign authority and that India was to be constituted as a sovereign, secular, democratic republic. Universal adult franchise was set to bring a 5-fold increase in the electorate, extending it from 3.5 crores of voters to 17 crores of voters who were to participate in the first parliamentary elections of independent India. As Alladi Krishnaswamy Iyer observed, in spite of the ignorance and illiteracy of the large mass of the Indian people, the Assembly has adopted the principle of adult franchise with an abundant faith in the common man and the ultimate success of democratic rule, and in the full belief that the introduction of democratic government on the basis of adult suffrage will bring enlightenment and promote the well-being, the standard of life, the comfort, and the decent living of common citizens. The introduction of universal adult franchise was truly a revolutionary act at a time when such a right had only recently been extended to women, people of color, and the working class in supposedly mature Western democracies. In this sense, our Constitution was a feminist document, as well as an egalitarian, socially transformative document. It was a break from the colonial and pre-colonial legacy, the boldest move adopted by the Constitution that was truly a product of Indian imagination. The drafters of our Constitution were cognizant that political equality will not suffice to weed out the inequality that existed in the social and economic spheres of Indian society. Even before the Constitution came into force, Dr. Ambedkar remarked about the contrasting realities which gripped the country at the time of its inception, where people, as he said, would enter a life of contradictions, having equality in political life, but inequality in socio-economic life. He said, and I quote him, "On the 26th of January 1950, we are going to enter into a life of contradictions. In politics, we will have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality. In politics, we will be recognizing the principle of one man, one vote, one value. In our social and economic life, we shall, by reason of our social and economic structure, continue to deny the principle of one man, one value." In view of these observations, the principle of one person, one vote was adopted in the hope that political equality will gradually help overcome and diminish the deep and abiding structural inequalities which plagued India. Universal adult franchise, enshrined in Article 326 of our Constitution, was committed to transforming a fractured society into a democratic, participatory, and egalitarian society, translating India's political equality into social transformation, guided by the values of human dignity, liberty, equality, fraternity, and social justice. Now let's come closer home over the last 70 years, the post-independence experiments and experiences. As we see, universal adult franchise was a solid determination of India's founding leaders to create a democratic state. However, the translation of the right to vote being bestowed upon citizens and its realization has not been a simple journey. The Constituent Assembly Secretariat started the preparation of electoral rolls in 1947 itself. It began issuing press releases which allowed it to communicate with the public. In response to concerns, the precise method and procedure of creating the electoral rolls was published in the press. The constitutional advisor, B.N. Rao, himself oversaw these press releases. The press releases informed the public of the stories of what happens next and any recurring alterations to the procedure. A distinguished scholar, Ornit Shani, while describing the work of the Constituent Assembly Secretariat, writes, "In the same way, an intimate address in a novel allows people to conjure up a uniquely vivid experience. The Constituent Assembly Secretariat's correspondence enabled people to conjure up a world of universal adult franchise." The preparation of the first electoral roll was also a momentous task, as the majority of the population, 86%, was illiterate, and the new Republic of India was grappling with the horrors of partition, war, and famine. While preparing the first electoral rolls, many women's names were missing, and instead there was a description of the voter as X's mother or Y's wife. Young girls married off at an early age and forced to shift to a different matrimonial village found it extremely difficult to get their names enrolled in the electoral constituency of their spouse's village. The Election Commission had to rectify this and redo the exercise again. It also took time to notify the reserved constituencies for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, as relevant data was not available immediately. Furthermore, to increase its reach to the widest section of the population, the newly created Election Commission of India at the time innovated with outreach campaigns. It ran a documentary on franchise and duties of the electorate in over 3,000 cinema halls to encourage citizens. This was done to educate the masses about the election process. The Election Commission thus achieved the feat of preparing the first electoral rolls for 176 million Indians aged 21 years and more, for deciding the fate of 4,500 seats, including 500 for Parliament and 4,000 for the state assemblies. Right from the first elections of independent India, Indian citizens have demonstrated enthusiasm in participating in the electoral processes. Several constitutional commentators have believed that India will not be able to survive as a constitutional democracy, but our citizens have proved them to be wrong. Universal adult franchise helped establish a sense of belonging and responsibility among citizens as equal stakeholders in the country's progress. This sense of belonging and faith in democracy is best captured by the life of late Sri Shyam Saran Negi, the first voter of independent India in 1951, who recently passed away on 5th November 2022, just 3 days after voting for the 34th time in the Uttarakhand State Assembly elections. He had along the way encouraged everyone to cast their votes and choose candidates after mindful deliberation. It has to be ensured that everyone is able to participate in elections. For instance, the Election Commission has on multiple occasions set up polling booths for a single voter. During the 2004 general elections, the Commission set up a polling booth for just this one voter. In the same vein, the plight of migrant workers must be considered, who most often are unable to effectively cast their vote in their constituency. Most migrant voters leave their hometowns and have to migrate to different cities in search of livelihood, to different states and different corners of the country in search of livelihood for themselves and their families. One aspect which we must emphasize is the participation in the electoral process by those communities who initially did not have the right to vote but were granted the right by the Constitution. Post-independence history tells us that the marginalized communities such as the Dalits have considered the right to vote and the idea of universal adult franchise as a sacrosanct feature of the Indian Constitution. These communities have shown a kind of ownership of the Constitution because they believed that it was the Constitution which gave them equal rights as well as the power to exercise and claim those rights. Therefore, we must not look at the particular history of post-independence India from solely a political lens, but we must understand that it is an interlinked phenomenon with the social emergence of democratic ideas. We see that the raising of political demands by the marginalized accompanied their demand to have equal rights and constitutional safeguards. Universal adult franchise, in that sense, acted as an equalizing force in shaping the future of India. Those who were denied the rights and powers now became a force, a deciding force, in selecting the composition of Parliament. This is an example of how political transformation through universal adult franchise led to social transformation in Indian society. Universal adult franchise provided confidence to the oppressed communities whose right to even believe in themselves was taken away by oppressive structures and groups. Let me dwell now on the Panchayati Raj. Several years after independence, it was felt that there must be a decentralization of the constitutional structure. The idea was to deepen democracy and to make it further deliberative. Several individuals from the people's movement, as well as the leading lawmakers and jurists, including Dr. L.M. Singhvi, played a significant role in taking the idea of decentralization forward. Dr. Singhvi chaired the Committee for Revitalization of Panchayati Raj Institutions for Democracy and Development, popularly known as the L.M. Singhvi Committee. The committee submitted its report in 1986 and identified Gram Sabhas as the incarnation of direct democracy and put forward the proposal of constitutional recognition of local self-governing institutions. The report also focused on the importance of conducting panchayat elections without delay. the provision of adequate financial resources to Panchayat Raj institutions, and the establishment of Panchayati Raj judicial tribunals, among others. The most significant achievement of the LM Singhvi Committee was that it led to the constitutional recognition of Panchayati Raj institutions in 1992 through the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Act, leading to the insertion of Part 9 in the Constitution. These amendments gave a new dimension to the entire concept of democratic decentralization of power to the rural people of the country. These amendments had an effect on the conception of democracy itself, which is a basic feature of the Indian Constitution. The Supreme Court has held that the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendments enhanced the basic feature of the Constitution in the case which is reported as the NCT of Delhi versus the Union of India in July 2018. Our court has held that the structures of governance created through these amendments have constitutionally entrenched participatory and representative democracy. Furthermore, the existence of panchayats to tribal areas, the extension of panchayats to tribal areas through the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act of 1996 is a constitutional recognition of the legacy and culture of self-governance that the indigenous communities have. It also tells us that the practice of democracy through universal adult franchise is not just limited to Delhi, but is happening in the remotest parts of India. How do we view universal adult franchise and participatory democracy? Universal adult franchise is not limited to exercising the right to vote once every 5 years. Rather, citizens engage with political processes all the time and reflect their choice through their votes later. Thus, the concept of universal adult franchise is linked with the idea of participatory democracy. Our 9-judge bench decision of the Supreme Court in case Puttaswamy of 2017 has held, and I quote, "It must be realized that it is the right to question, the right to scrutinize, and the right to dissent which enables an informed citizenry to scrutinize the actions of government. Those who are governed are entitled to question those who govern about the discharge of their constitutional duties, including in the provision of socio-economic welfare benefits. The power to scrutinize and to reason enables the citizens of a democratic polity to make informed decisions on basic issues which govern their rights. The exercise of the right to vote by citizens is an informed choice made by them. The actual realization of one's vote is to continuously participate in democracy in everyday life, to ask questions from the elected representatives, and to keep the state accountable. Consultation, dialogue, debate, and negotiation occur among diverse social groups, with participation not confined to elections, but extend to the larger political and public spheres to facilitate social transformations. The citizens' ability to participate in electoral democracy and promote good governance was also enhanced to the tool of the right to information. On a similar note, the Supreme Court of India recently inaugurated the online right to information portal, which further eases and facilitates the process for citizens to file RTI applications and access information. What does the Indian experiment with universal adult franchise then tell us? The Indian experiment with universal adult franchise contradicts all myths against it. It was believed that only a few had the wisdom to vote or to vote wisely. Our experience tells us that even the most vulnerable have the political consciousness to choose their leader they want. Therefore, we must reject every form of elite understanding of the democratic process, which we keep hearing constantly, that only the educated are better decision makers. Individuals whom society has despised as being uneducated have shown tremendous political acumen and awareness of local problems, which even the educated may not readily understand. The elite perception that only the educated or few individuals should have the right to vote shows contempt and distrust towards democracy. Since independence, there are lakhs of examples of how individuals have used the power they received in the form of their right to vote to exercise political power beyond merely electing their representatives, as they formed pressure groups and movements exerting and influencing the elected representatives to further the rights of individuals and engineer a social transformation. This is truly reflective of the power of participative democracy. Electoral democracy has been an agent of pervasive change at the village and municipal levels. The reservation of seats for women and marginalized social groups in panchayats has given them the power to shape their own destinies. It is a silent revolution done by the universal adult franchise in India. There are numerous examples across India of exemplary work done by women sarpanches or all women panchayats in different parts of India. This also demonstrates the bottom-top approach to governance. Lastly, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar believed that universal adult suffrage would act as a stimulus that would help gradually transform India's political equality into social and economic equality. The Indian experience has shown us the transformative potential of universal adult franchise. I'm deeply grateful to the Dr. Singhvi family for inviting me for this lecture. Namaskar.